Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Peaceful Coding Tutorials, and today we're going to look at how to code Wordle as a web application. So if you haven't played Wordle before, you're living under a rock. But that's alright, we can still explain the rules. Pretty much you guess a 5-letter word like ocean or something like that, and you get an indication of how close you were to the actual word of the day. And so we know that there's an O in the first position and an N in the last position of the word. And there's an E somewhere in the word, but it's not in the third position. Okay, so now we just need to figure out what this word actually is. The E is probably not here because I don't know many words that are OE. So the E is probably in the 5th position, and so that makes it O blank blank EN. Often. All right, we got super lucky. So that is the basis. So the word was often. So let's see how we can actually go ahead and code this thing up. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make our starter files. Let's make an index.html file. Let's also go ahead and make a style.css file, and let's make a JavaScript file. So we've got our structure with our HTML. We'll go ahead and use the auto-completion to create our basic document. And let's also go ahead and import our JavaScript file. And let's also go ahead and import our CSS file. Perfect. Okay, great. And let's open this up with Live Server. Live Server is a great extension that lets you open up a web project and an HTML file and have it auto reload as you make changes. So we can do something and those changes happen instantly over here. Okay, great. So from here, let's go ahead and just try to create the structure of the Wordle game. And maybe it's going to be helpful to kind of look at it as we do this. But essentially we know that we have 6 rows of 5 and 5 columns, and we'll do a little bit of a different thing for the keyboard down here. But yeah, let's go ahead and make these boxes, and we can just we could also, there's so many of these boxes, it might be worth just doing this in the JavaScript actually. So let's do that, and we'll make just one container for all these boxes that we'll call container. And let's actually go ahead and look at how we would add these boxes in the JavaScript. So we can say, okay, there are some amount of rows, there are 6 rows, and there are 5 columns. And let's go ahead and iterate. So we'll make some while loops here, or some for loops rather. So while I is equal to 0, I is less than the number of rows, I plus plus. So for the number of rows there are, just add a row to the HTML. Okay, so we'll make a row element, and to do that we can use document.createElement. This is a function that's built into the browser, and it lets us make some kind of element. Let's just make a div, which is a plain rectangle in HTML. From here, let's go ahead and add 5 boxes to our row element, so 5 cells we could call them. And so we'll say, okay, let's make another loop inside of our loop, and we'll say for the number of columns there are, go ahead and create a cell element. And we will use the same syntax, document.createElement, div, and then we'll add this cell to our row element. So row element.append, child, cell element. Okay, perfect. And it also might be a good idea to give these things some kind of ID. Maybe we want to give our cells some kind of ID such that we'll be able to reference them later. Or, you know, what we could do is we could store a reference to all these things in a matrix structure up here. And I kind of like the idea of that, so let's do that. So we'll say our cell elements are in here, this array, and then we will put rows of cell elements in here, kind of like this, but we'll do it with our loop. So this will start off empty, and we'll say const row is an empty array. And while we're also putting these things on the DOM on the page, the DOM is the document object model, I think. What does that stand for? Oh, okay. document object model. Perfect. So that's just honestly a fancy way of saying the page in the browser. Okay, so not only are we going to put these cell elements on the page, we're also going to store a reference to them in our cell elements thing up here, which we'll use. I might be getting ahead of myself. Let's actually just delete that for now. So we'll just start off by putting these on the page. So we've added the cells to the row. Let's add the row to the page. So we'll get a reference to that container element that we created earlier. And I believe we just gave that the class container. So let's use a document. We'll call this container element is document.querySelector. And we'll select it by that container class. Okay, so the last thing we need to do here is we need to say add each row element, which is already full of these cell elements, to the page, container element dot append child row element. Great. Okay, so we can't see anything because these don't look like anything yet. But what we can say is let's make it so that any div inside a div inside our container class should be styled a certain way. So we'll say height is going to be 20 pixels, width 20 pixels. This should probably be a bit bigger, to be honest. And background gray. We can actually use a cool Chrome plugin I have to see exactly what this color is. Or, well, I guess these things are actually white open squares. So we'll grab that color and we'll use the hex code. And so this is not actually a background, it's a border. Okay, so far so good. And we need to have these things actually display horizontally inside of a row. And so we'll get the row, which is going to be the immediate div child of the container. We could also have given our divs classes, but this is fine. So we'll make this display flex. And then let's also give these things some margin. So that's kind of a bit too big. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, great. So we could also put this in the center of our page if we wanted to. So let's just do that. Container margin auto. Okay, nothing's happening. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll actually style the body of our document and say, okay, make the body of our document display in such a way that everything is centered within it. So we'll give it the display flex property, and then we'll say line items inside of it in the center. And you know what? I'm struggling a bit here, but I think we actually want to do this on the row element rather than the container. Final answer, maybe. So another way you can quickly experiment if things just aren't working like they're not for me right now is you can do Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C on Windows and click around in the browser, and then you can find the element that you're looking for and give it some styling right there in the browser. So we can try some different properties. Maybe it's justify content we're looking for. And there we go. That is, in fact, what we're looking for. So we want justify content center here. And things are looking good now. Note that those changes that you make in this HTML, CSS pane in the browser, they're not actually permanent. So if you refresh the page, any changes you make here will disappear. It's just a good way of kind of temporarily experimenting with different CSS properties. All right, so let's continue. This looks pretty good. The other thing we're gonna want is some way for the user to input their guess, and the New York Times does this in a fancier way than we're going to. Let's just put like an input text box down here and a button for the user to submit their answer. And so back in our HTML, right under our container, we'll make a text input. And I don't think we actually need anything beyond just the input. There it is. I guess we need the button too. So let's just add a button. We'll call it submit. Oh, looking great. Okay, so we might want to center these things. And so let's actually plop these inside of a div, and then we'll give that div a class so that we can style it in our CSS. And we'll call this submit container. Copy that, and let's write a quick style rule for it to say that its children should display side by side in a row instead of its current system. I think I've got a small problem here, which is that I had my input outside of my submit container. So we want these things to display side by side, and we also want them centered on the page. So justify content, center. And then lastly, let's space it out from the actual game a little bit. So we'll say margin top, it spaces it out. And then lastly, let's go ahead and add a little bit of space in between our text input and our submit button. So we'll say submit container input. We'll select that input element and give it a little bit of margin to the right of it. Okay, that looks great. So let's actually get into coding the JavaScript of our game now. And what we'll need to do is we need to accept user inputs for 6 rounds, 6 guesses, and then we need to highlight the the inputs, and we also need to render the inputs on the page properly. So if we wanted to get fancy, we could also add some functionality around restricting them to just having a 5-letter input, but I think it's not worth doing that for this example. So let's just go ahead and we'll start off by, I think we'll need to track which guess we're on. And so we can start off by making a variable that keeps track of this. I'll call this the guess index, and we'll define this with a let declaration word to indicate that this thing is going to change as time goes on. From here, let's determine when the submit button is clicked and do something based on that. And so we'll say document.querySelector, we'll get this button element is equal to document.querySelector, and we'll just select it by its button tag because there's only one of these buttons on the page. From here, let's go ahead and add an event listener to this thing, button element.add event listener click, and we'll say that when it's clicked, something should happen. We can just test it out with a simple console.log right now and verify that that's working. So if we click our button, there we go, we've got our console log. Looks great. Okay, cool. So what actually should happen when we click this button? We want to get whatever's inside of this input. And so let's do that. And we'll get a reference to our input element. We can also just grab it by its tag input because there's only one input on the page. And let's, instead of logging out hello world, we'll log out whatever's inside of the input element. And to do that, we're gonna use input element.value. Test that out. And there we go, looks good. Okay, cool. So honestly, why not just add a little bit of validation to say, only do something if this is a 5-letter input. So we can go ahead and get the user's guess, which we already established is going to be input.value, and we'll say if guess.length does not equal 5, then let's show the user a warning or an error, invalid guess length, and then we'll return, and that is just a way of exiting out of this click listener function immediately so that we won't proceed to the later on code. And so we'll test that. We'll do a 1-letter. We press submit, and it says invalid guess length. And then let's do 5 letters. Okay, and great, nothing happens. So we know that we did not enter this if statement, and we're somewhere down here. All right, so all we really need to do now is we need to say show their guess at the proper row. And so let's do that, and then we'll continue with whatever we need to do next, which is going to be color coding the guess appropriately. And yeah, we'll just start off with displaying the guess in these cells. And we'll want to kind of iterate through each letter in the guess to say, for each letter, put it in the proper cell. So let's do that, and we can just go ahead and iterate through this guess. So for I equals 0, I is less than the length of our guess, I plus plus, and we'll say, okay, during this loop, go ahead and pull out each letter of the guess string one by one. So say letter is equal to guess index.im. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to say grab the cell that we need here. And to do that, let's think about it for a moment. I think there's some way that we can say, give us all of the container elements, all of the elements inside the container. You know what, we can probably just do that with query select all. So we'll say all the rows is going to be document.query selector all, and we'll say give us all of the divs that are immediately inside a container. And let's console.log this out to see if what I'm about to try is actually going to work. And so and we're doing this every iteration of the loop. We don't really need to do that. So let's just put it up here above our loop. Okay, so if we put in a 5-letter guess, we get this list, and I think this might just work. So I'm assuming this first div does in fact correspond to the first row, and it looks like it's corresponding perfectly. So that's great. Okay, so what we'll say is we know which row to get based on the guess index, and so this will just be a simple saying that the row that we want to deal with is rows indexed at the guess index. Great, and then for each letter, go ahead and get all of the so now we need to figure out how to get all the cells inside a row. I think maybe we can do row.query selector all. We're really going out on a limb here, but I'm hoping this works. So let's test out. We're going to say, oh, nice. It looks like we might be good. So we were able to just look for all of the divs inside the row element that we already determined with this code here. And we got an array of the cell elements. Perfect. So from here, we can now say during each iteration of our loop, assign the cell at index I. We could pull this out into its own variable too. That might make things a little bit more clearer and readable. So set the cell's inner text. You could also use inner HTML here. It doesn't matter. Equal to the letter. And let's try it out. Click submit. And wow, all right, we got something. So let's improve the styling a little bit. And they're using a nice sans serif font. So let's do that. We'll just give everything on the page a sans serif font. Okay, that's a little bit better. And then also inside of our cell, let's give this a display flex, and we will align the items inside this to the center in both directions. And to do that, we'll do align item center, justify content center. Nice, looking really good. And let's also make this just a little bit bigger. So font size. Oop, that's smaller. Okay, that looks pretty perfect. Maybe we'll bold it as well, font weight bold. Nice. Okay. So next up is we need to color code these the right color, and there's different ways we could do this, but one way is we're gonna have to write some logic to determine, hey, is it green, yellow, or gray, and from there style it accordingly. And so this is where we're going to need to assign, we're going to need to look at all the letters, and we're going to need to look at all the letters of the correct answer and go from there. So let's write a function that actually figures this out just on the logic side of things, and from there we can go ahead and add the styling rules to render the letter properly as either green, gray, or yellow. And so we can call this function determine letter status or something like that, or letter statuses or letters status. Maybe determine guess status could be good. And this will take in the guess, and it also needs to take in the correct word, which we haven't really decided on yet. We could honestly use I'm just realizing this is exposing that I already tried this before I started filming and I got stumped. But that aside, we need to decide what the correct word should be. And I'm trying to remember, what was it? It was often, I believe. All right, so we'll just define the correct word up at the top of the page. For Wordle, I think they use a database somewhere, and then they fetch information from that database. But yeah, we'll say that the correct word is often. And we actually don't really need to pass it in as a parameter here, because we can just reference this global variable. Okay, so what we'll do is, I guess we first need to figure out, how does this actually work? How does the logic work? And I think what we have to do is we need to first figure out, okay, which letters are green, then we'll figure out what letters are yellow, and then we can put all the rest as gray. Okay, so maybe we could use a recursive solution for this, I think. So let's actually go ahead and pass in the correct word here, and that'll help for the recursive solution we're about to put together. Recursion is when a function calls itself, and it can be handy for solving certain kind of algorithmic-y problems. Okay, so let's start off by looping through the word and seeing what letters are green. And we can make, our output can be a little bit of a map from letters to their status, and we'll have 3 statuses: green, yellow, or gray. So first off, let's figure out which letters are green, and we'll just go ahead and loop through our guess. I wonder if we can actually just do for const letter in guess. It's possible that, I think it's unwise, because we're going to want to use this index to get the equivalent letter in the correct word. So let's just stick with our typical for loop. So for I is less than guess.length, which we know will be 5, and we'll say get the guess letter and the correct letter. So guess index.I and correct letter index.I. And I don't totally know how we're going to go about this still, but I'm sure it'll come to us as we work on this. So we know that it's green. So we'll say that this is looking for greens. We know that's green if these things are just the same. So if guess letter equals correct letter map, or maybe we just make this 5 an array where each value in the array, each status in the array corresponds to the sort of letter with that same index in the guess. And we'll start off by just putting 5 nulls in here to represent that we have not figured out what the color of these things is yet. Okay, so we'll say if the guess letter equals the correct letter, then the map index.I is going to equal green. And that's it for greens. So let's look for yellows now. Look for yellows. And maybe there's a more efficient way to do this. I'm also kind of thinking we're not going to use recursion after all, but that's how it goes. You know, as you figure out a solution, it's okay to change your approach. Okay, so now that we've assigned all the greens, let's go ahead and do yellows. And to do that, we'll have to, it's going to be a little harder than greens. It's going to be a little more complicated, because we need to say, for any letter, determine if that letter appears in the word and is not already green. And if that's true, then it's going to be yellow. So And we also need to say, and it's not already... I'm thinking of weird edge cases, like what if there were 2 letters in a word? So maybe it's good to write out a weird edge case that we can look at. So let's think of here's a word, goose. Okay, so let's say this is the correct word, and let's say our guess word is goner. That's too easy. We need an O later on in the word in one of the last 2 positions. So, oh, we can do the first position. Ogres. That's actually a pretty good guess. Just in that it'll give us good edge cases. So what we need to figure out is how to make this yellow. Actually, maybe this is just totally fine. Okay, what if we guessed this ugru and somehow that's a word? We need to make it so that not all 3 of these are yellow and only 2 of them can be yellow. Oh, that's tricky. That is tricky. We could also just not we could just not handle that case, but I would like to. I think it'd be nice to. And the question is there a suave solution for this? So for the first one, so we kind of need to know how many yellows already exist for that letter. I don't think there's any way of getting around that. So we need to say, hey, if there's an O here, check this word for an O. And if it exists, look at how many O's in the word have already been made green or yellow. And if there's additional O's available, then make it yellow. And if not, then it's going to be gray. Okay, so let's embark on this. And we will once again iterate through the letters. And so we'll say, here's the guess letter. We don't really care about what the equivalent letter is going to be because we know that we already dealt with all the greens, which maybe means we should also skip the greens, or we could actually possibly combine these loops. That might be the move. So we'll say, okay, let's actually just combine these loops. So we're going to do it more like this. So we're going to look for greens in this if statement, and then we'll look for yellows in this next one. Look for yellows. Okay, so we need to say determine if the letter we need to determine how many gray how many gray letters of that letter exist in the string. It's actually quite tricky. Okay, so we get rid of this loop, and let's just start by saying, does the letter exist in the correct word? If correct word dot includes letter, and then we need to say and like the number of greens and yellows in our guess word, aka this map. We can call this, let's call this color map to make it a little more clear what it is. For that same letter does not exceed the number of those letters in this word, then we're good. So we need to somehow say, we need to get the number of num gray letters for guess letter, if that makes sense. So the number of gray letters for the guess letter, we'll have to look back through our string, determine. So I think we need to loop again here, and we'll need to figure out this value as we loop. So it'll start at 0, and we'll say, okay, for j is equal to 0, j is less than guess.length, j++, and we'll say if the guess indexed at j is equal to the same letter we're on, guess letter, and it's gray, which we know by color map j is equal to gray, which we haven't actually assigned any yet, then we can increment num gray letters. Surely I didn't make any mistakes with that, surely, hopefully. We will see, time will tell. Okay, so if the word includes it and the number of gray letters for that guess letter is greater than 0, this might be all we need. No, we need both these. Then we know that the letter is yellow after all. Okay, so that was actually really difficult to figure out which letters were yellow. Color map I equals yellow. Okay, and if all that is not true, then it is gray. Oh, we could also do undefined. So gray or undefined. So maybe we actually just start these at gray, and then we don't need this. That could be the move. So let's start all these at gray. And gray can be spelled with an E or an A. I don't know which one's right. Let's do an E. Looks fine. Okay. Maybe we're good. Maybe. So maybe we'll say determine color map. Guess color map. Okay, and finally we need to return the color map from this function. Okay. Oh, look, I spelled it with an A that time. That's a bad sign. Let's switch them all to A's. Why not? No, we'll leave them as how they are. It's fine. Okay, so that was a helpful example. Surely there's no other edge cases that we haven't thought about, surely. But let's proceed. So we are assuming that we've done the logic correct. We just need to do the rendering of these letters as their correct color. And we can just start off by making it somewhat ugly, and then we'll improve it as we go. So let's just say that so we're back to our place where we're clicking the submit button, we're handling the guess. One thing we can also do during this step is we can clear the input. So input element dot value equals clear that thing. And so now we go through the letters. We also want to, let's get the color map here. Color map, we'll call all that nice logic that we just wrote. Guess. We'll pass in the correct word as an argument, doesn't really matter. And then from here we'll say, as we're iterating through our guess, go ahead and get the color map index at I, and then set the cell's background color, cell.style.background color equal to that color. And somehow we didn't ever use that letter, so something went wrong. No, we used it here. What's going on? Huh? I've messed something up. I don't know what though. Oh, somehow I got rid of my brackets here. Very strange. Okay, background color equals color. Alrighty. So our correct word is often here. Let's try the same thing we did before with ocean. Okay, nothing happened. That's not great. Let's look at our console. And a letter's not defined. Huh? Where? Here? No, it's defined there. That looks good. Where else? Okay, line 62. Oh. Oh, it's called guess letter. Okay, correct. If correct word includes guess letter. Okay, there we go. I think that's what we meant. Okay, let's try it again. So, ocean. Nice. All right, let's make these look a little bit better. I mean, the game is pretty much done at this point. Oh no, we didn't advance our guess index. So the last thing we need to do after all of this is we just need to increment our guess index plus plus. So we could do ocean, often, boom, boom. Honestly, we could spend time styling this, but this looks pretty good to me. So that's how you do it. That's how you make Wordle, folks. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any requests, feel free to make comments, and have a nice day.